and welcome to Read Aloud with me, Dan. Today we're going to read from Chapter 6 of The Right of Nations to Self-Determination by Lenin. In Chapter 6, Vladimir Lenin tries to get Rosa Luxemburg to understand that the secession of Norway from Sweden, a union which had earlier been thrust upon Norway and maintained by force, strengthened the relationship and understanding between the Norwegian proletarians and the Swedish proletarians, despite the ultimate victory of the Norwegian petty bourgeoisie, who were unfortunately organized enough to vote down a national referendum on forming a republic following the secession. In this chapter, Rosa sets a trap for herself and falls right in. If you've ever watched The Coyote and Roadrunner, you know exactly what I mean. To spell it out, Rosa's the coyote in this analogy, and she dropped an intellectual piano on her own head. Chapter 6: Norway's Secession from Sweden. Rosa Luxemburg cites precisely this example and discusses it as follows. The latest event in the history of federative relations, the secession of Norway from Sweden, which at the time was hastily seized upon by the social patriotic Polish press as a gratifying sign of the strength and progressive nature of the tendency towards state secession, at once provided striking proof that federalism and its concomitant separation are in no way an expression or progress of democracy. After the so-called Norwegian Revolution, which meant that the Swedish king was deposed and compelled to leave Norway, the Norwegians coolly proceeded to choose another king, formally rejecting, by a national referendum, the proposal to establish a republic. That which superficial admirers of all national movements and all semblance of independence proclaimed to be a revolution was simply a manifestation of peasant and petty bourgeois particularism, the desire to have a king of their own for their money, instead of one imposed upon them by the Swedish aristocracy, and was, consequently, a movement that had absolutely nothing in common with revolution. At the same time, the dissolution of the union between Sweden and Norway showed once more to what extent, in this case also, the federation which had existed until then was only an expression of purely dynastic interests, and therefore merely a form of monarchism and reaction. This is from Napersod, or Forward, the central organ of the Central Democratic Party of Galicia and Silesia, published in Krakow, beginning with 1892. It says the newspaper, which was a vehicle of petty bourgeois nationalist ideas, was described by Lenin as a very bad and not at all Marxist organ. And that is literally all that Rosa Luxemburg has to say on this score. So Rosa is saying, hey, Norway seceded from Sweden. And then after that, the Swedish king was deposed. But then, what was it here? The Swedes picked another king for themselves? The Norwegians, excuse me, after the Swedish king was deposed, compelled to leave Norway, the Norwegians just picked another king. She goes, so much for your national self-determination or whatever, right? She goes, Lenin says, that's literally all Rosa Luxemburg has to say on this score. Admittedly, it would have been different for her to have revealed the hopelessness of her position more saliently than she has done in this particular instance. The question was and is, do the Social Democrats in a mixed national state need a program that recognizes the right to self-determination or secession? What does the example of Norway, cited by Rosa Luxemburg, tell us on this point? So Rosa brought it up. If you're going to bring up Norway, you're going to have to discuss it. That's how that works. These are the rules. He says our author twists and turns, exercises her wit, and rails at Nepersot, but she does not answer the question. Rosa Luxemburg speaks about everything under the sun so as to avoid saying a single word about the actual point at issue. He says she's avoiding the point. Lenin says, undoubtedly, in wishing to have a king of their own for their money, and in rejecting a national referendum, the proposal to establish a republic, the Norwegian petty bourgeoisie displayed exceedingly bad Philistine qualities. Undoubtedly, Napersot displayed equally bad and equally Philistine qualities in failing to notice this. But what has all this to do with the case? The question under discussion was the right of nations to self-determination and the attitude to be adopted by the socialist proletariat towards this right. Why then does not Rosa Luxemburg answer this question instead of beating around the bush? To a mouse, there is no stronger beast than the cat, it is said. To Rosa Luxemburg, there is evidently no stronger beast than the Frassi. Or is it Fraki? I really don't know. I'm going to stick with my first pronunciation. Frassi, or something, is the popular term for the Polish Socialist Party. Its so-called revolutionary section and the Krakow newspaper Napersot shares the views of that section. Rosa Luxemburg is so blinded by her fright against the nationalism of that section that she loses sight of everything except Napersot. So in this section, Lenin says Rosa Luxemburg has Frassi derangement syndrome. But they didn't have those words back then. He says, if Napersot says yes, Rosa Luxemburg considers it's her sacred duty to say an immediate no, without stopping to think that by doing so she does not reveal independence of Napersot, but on the contrary, her ludicrous dependence on the Frassi and her inability to see things from a viewpoint any deeper and broader than that of the Krakow anthill. Napersot, of course, is a wretched and by no means Marxist organ, but that should not prevent us from properly analyzing the example of Norway once we have chosen it. This is what I always talk about. So you have to be prepared to agree with people you don't like. He says, to analyze this example in Marxist fashion, we must deal not with the vices of the awfully terrible Frassi, but first with the concrete historical features of the secession of Norway from Sweden, and secondly, with the tasks which confronted the proletariat of both countries in connection with this secession. We're doing okay so far, viewers? You may be a little lost if you haven't read previous chapters, so you're always encouraged to do that. I have videos. Well, I guess I haven't posted them yet, but I will post videos to help you think through these things. Reading on. We're talking about the concrete historical features of the secession from Norway from Sweden and the tasks which confronted the proletariat in both countries um, with regarding this secession. He says the geographic, economic, and language ties between Norway and Sweden are as intimate as those between the great Russians and many other Slav nations. So they do share that in common. But the union between Norway and Sweden was not a voluntary one. Oh. And in dragging the question of federation, Rosa Luxemburg was talking at random because she did not know what to say. Norway was ceded to Sweden by the monarchs during the Napoleonic Wars against the will of the Norwegians. And the Swedes had to bring in troops into Norway to subdue her. Despite the very extensive autonomy which Norway enjoyed, she had her own parliament, etc. There was constant friction between Norway and Sweden for many decades after the Union. And Norwegians strove hard to throw off the yoke of the Swedish aristocracy. At last, in August 1905, they succeeded. The Norwegian parliament resolved that the Swedish king was no longer king of Norway. And in the referendum held later among the Norwegian people, the overwhelming majority, about 200,000 as against a few hundred, voted for complete separation from Sweden. After a short period of indecision, the Swedes resigned themselves to the fact of secession. This example shows us on what grounds cases of the secession of nations are practicable and actually occur under modern economic and political relationships, and the form secession sometimes assumes under conditions of political freedom and democracy. No social democrat will deny, unless he would profess indifference to questions of political freedom and democracy, in which case he is naturally no longer a social democrat, that this example virtually proves that it is the bounden duty of class-conscious workers to conduct systematic propaganda and prepare the ground for the settlement of conflicts that may arise over the secession of nations. Not in the Russian way, but only in the way they were settled in 1905 between Norway and Sweden. This is exactly what is meant by the demand in the program for the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination. But Rosa Luxemburg tried to get around a fact that was repugnant to her theory by violently attacking her Philistinism of the Norwegian Philistines and the Krakow Napersot. For she understood perfectly well that this historical fact completely refutes her phrases about the rights of nations to self-determination being a utopia, or like the right to eat off gold plates, etc. So she brings up this example that does not prove her point. It somehow is, she doesn't realize it's proving the opposite. It's wild. He says such phrases only express a smug and opportunist belief in the immutability of the present alignment of forces among the nationalities of Eastern Europe. He's calling it, he says that's metaphysics. You believe in the immutability of the present situation? That's metaphysics. Things change. He says to proceed in the question of the self-determination of nations. As in every other question, we are interested first and foremost in the self-determination of the proletariat within a given nation. Rosa Luxemburg modestly evaded this question too, for she realized that an analysis of it on the basis of the example of Norway, which she herself had chosen, would be disastrous to her theory. What position did the Norwegian and Swedish proletariat take, and indeed had to take, in the conflict over secession? After Norway seceded, the class-conscious workers of Norway would naturally have voted for a republic. And if some socialists voted otherwise, it only goes to show how much dense Philistine opportunism there sometimes is in the European socialist movement. That is true. There can be no two opinions about that. And we mention the point only because Rosa Luxemburg is trying to obscure the issue by speaking off the mark. And I don't exactly, I don't know what that means. I don't know what he means by off. I don't know what he means. It seems unimportant to me, though. He says, we do not know whether the Norwegian socialist program made it obligatory for Norwegian social democrats to hold particular views on the question of secession. He goes, we don't really know the inner workings of the Norwegian social democrats. He says, we'll assume it did not, and that the Norwegian socialists left it an open question as to what extent the autonomy of Norway gave sufficient scope to wage the class struggle freely, or to what extent the eternal friction and conflict with the Swedish aristocracy hindered freedom of economic life. But it cannot be disputed that the Norwegian proletariat had to oppose this aristocracy and support Norwegian peasant democracy with all its Philistine limitations. And referring to the class-conscious workers of Norway would have naturally voted for a republic, he says, since the majority of the Norwegian nation was in favor of a monarchy, while the proletariat wanted a republic, the Norwegian proletariat was, generally speaking, confronted with the alternative, either revolution, if conditions were ripe for it, or submission to the will of the majority in prolonged propaganda and agitation work. And this is a note from Lenin himself. Makes me wonder when he added this. Did he add it when he was writing it, or like after the fact? He says, and the Swedish proletariat, it is common knowledge that the Swedish landed proprietors, abetted by the Swedish clergy, advocated war against Norway. Inasmuch as Norway was much weaker than Sweden, had already experienced a Swedish invasion, and the Swedish aristocracy carries enormous weight in its own country, this advocacy of war presented a grave danger. We may be sure that the Swedish Kokoshkins spent much time and energy in trying to corrupt the minds of the Swedish people by appeals to handle the elastic formulas of political self-determination of nations carefully, by painting horrific pictures of the danger of the disintegration of the state, and by assuring them that people's freedom was compatible with the traditions of the Swedish aristocracy. There cannot be the slightest doubt that the Swedish Social Democrats would have betrayed the cause of socialism and democracy if they had not fought with all their might to combat both the landlord and the Kokoshkin ideology and policy, and if they had failed to demand not only equality of nations in general, to which the Kokoshkins also subscribe, but also the right of nations to self-determination, Norway's freedom to secede. The close alliance between the Norwegian and Swedish workers, their complete fraternal class solidarity, gained from the Swedish workers' recognition of the right of Norwegians to secede. He says class solidarity was strengthened, not hurt. Stop it. He says this convinced the Norwegian workers that the Swedish workers were not infected with Swedish nationalism, and that they placed fraternity with the Norwegian proletarians above the privileges of the Swedish bourgeoisie and aristocracy. The dissolution of the ties imposed upon Norway by the monarchists of Europe and the Swedish aristocracy strengthened the ties between the Norwegian and Swedish workers. The Swedish workers have proved that in spite of all the vicissitudes of bourgeois policy, bourgeois relations may quite possibly bring about a repetition of the forcible subjection of the Norwegians to the Swedes. They will be able to preserve and defend the complete equality and class solidarity of the workers of both nations in the struggle against both the Swedish and the Norwegian bourgeoisie. Incidentally, this reveals how groundless and even frivolous are the attempts sometimes made by the Frasi to use our disagreements with Rosa Luxemburg against Polish social democracy. The Frasi are not a proletarian or a socialist party, but a petty bourgeois nationalist party, something like Polish social revolutionaries. And he sort of loses me there. There never has been, nor could there be, any question of unity between the Russian Social Democrats and this party. On the other hand, no Russian Social Democrat has ever repented of the close relations and unity that may have been established with the Polish Social Democrats. The Polish Social Democrats have rendered a great historical service by creating the first really Marxist proletarian party in Poland, a country imbued with nationalist aspirations and passions. Yet the service of the Polish Social Democrats have rendered is a great one, not because Rosa Luxemburg has talked a lot of nonsense about Clause 9 of the Russian Marxists' program, but despite that sad circumstance. He goes, hey, I don't have any problem with the Polish Social Democrats in general. You did a good job. You made the first Marxist organization in a very nationalist place. And we like you despite Rosa Luxemburg. Lenin says the question of the right to self-determination is, of course, not so important to the Polish Social Democrats as it is to the Russian. It's quite understandable that in their zeal, sometimes a little excessive perhaps, to combat the nationalistically blinded petty bourgeoisie of Poland, the Polish Social Democrats should overdo things. No Russian Marxist has ever thought of blaming the Polish Social Democrats for being opposed to the secession of Poland. These Social Democrats err only when, like Rosa Luxemburg, they try to deny the necessity of including the recognition of the right to self-determination in the program of the Russian Marxists. It's like, okay, I get that you're on a diet. You're not having cookies. That doesn't mean that I can't have cookies or something. He says virtually, this is like attempting to apply relationships, understandable by Krakow standards, to all the peoples and nations inhabiting Russia, including the great Russians. It means being Polish nationalists were the wrong way round, not Russian, not international social democrats. For international social democracy stands for the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination. International social democracy, aka communism, you know what I mean? Communists. And that is chapter 6, Norway's secession from Sweden, in which Rosa Luxemburg, in the style of Roadrunner and Coyote, sets a trap for herself and drops an intellectual piano on her own head. Lenin tries to get Luxemburg to understand the secession of Norway from Sweden and its historical concrete conditions, a union which had earlier been thrust upon Norway and maintained by force. This secession strengthen the relationship and understanding between the Norwegian proletarians and Swedish proletarians. Despite the ultimate victory of the Norwegian petty bourgeoisie, who were unfortunately organized enough to vote down a national referendum on forming a republic following the secession. And that was Chapter 6. If you enjoyed this, feel free to support my content. It means a lot, and it encourages me to make more. You could support with a subscription on Twitch. You could support on Patreon with a patronage. Patreon.com/IdanSimpson. You could support with a tip, Cash App, Venmo, PayPal, at IdanSimpson or idansimpson@gmail.com. That's going to be the show. If you're watching live, stick around. And if you're watching the replay, why don't you check out Chapter 7, the resolution of the London International Congress in 1896. Love your face.